Tropical Storm Frank enters stage in the Eastern Pacific, with possible activity in the Western Pacific too. And now the latest around the wide world of tropics. Tropical Weather Bulletin for July 27th. So, we're back on the board again on the main view here with Tropical Storm Frank now with us, the 6th named storm of the Eastern Pacific hurricane season and the 37th storm of the year so far. Elsewhere, nothing on the radar just yet, at least not from this broad view, although there is some activity on the way possibly in the Western Pacific at long last. On day 57 of the Atlantic hurricane season though, Atlantic fans will be waiting longer because there is nothing here expected in the next 5 days, no areas of interest whatsoever. So you'll have to look elsewhere. In the Eastern Pacific though, Tropical Storm Frank of course formed earlier today. It spent a few hours as a depression and then got upgraded to tropical storm status. Struggling a little bit with the wind shear, and so intensification will be slow to occur, could even weaken a little bit back to depression status for a time before strengthening again later. In the Western Pacific, we're now giving a 60% chance for Invest 93W, which could become a tropical cyclone as it rounds past the southern coast of Japan and then through the Ryukyu Islands on towards eastern China. It's uncertain about the long-range track of that storm yet, but we'll have some model scenarios in a moment. And in the South Indian Ocean, we've notched it back up again to 20% chance for that area of interest, with a little bit more model agreement recently. Could throw up a little bit of a surprise. We'll wait and see what happens with that one. It's running out of time. Let's take a look then at some satellite imagery, and this is what the Atlantic looks like right now. Lots of active weather patterns going on across the US, of course, at the moment, and in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a lot of debris there, I suppose you could call it, just loads of little bits of cloud. In the tropical zone though, it's pretty dead. The Eastern Pacific, lots and lots of dry air out to sea, as you can clearly make out there, and we've also got these two areas of interest. Well, one of them of course is now Tropical Storm Frank, the other one is still an area of interest to its northwest. They'll be fighting a little bit over the next couple of days, and that disturbance may become even a system in its own right. It's got a 50% chance from the National Hurricane Center. And here is a look at these two systems in more clarity on this visible satellite imagery, and you can see that Frank is struggling a little bit with that center of circulation, convection blowing up here and there, more often than not to be fair, but generally it's still struggling a little bit with that center of circulation becoming a little bit exposed. That's from wind shear predominantly, but dry air also appearing on the eastern side of the storm. So it's got a tricky start to its life, but the good news for land areas is that it's not going to affect any areas. Even if it deviated northwards, it's still quite clear of the Mexican coastline. In the Western Pacific, we've got this slew of activity in the Philippine Sea, this broad mess basically. It doesn't know what it wants to do, but you can see convection blowing up near the Mariana Islands, and that's where we're expecting this storm to originate from if it does get itself going. So convection firing at this point is a good sign for potential development over the next 5 days. Indian Ocean is looking interesting. Obviously the main point there is that banding that you can see in the southern hemisphere. It is starting to get better rotation, so keep watching it slowly. It's an extremely broad situation, and well, fairly unpredictable as whether it might just nick tropical storm status or not. And in the eastern areas off Australia, we've got a few frontal systems generally, but it's a fairly quiet picture. Well then, let's take a look at the sea surface temperatures, and this time we've marked, I forgot its name already. That's fantastic. Frank. We've forgotten Frank. But we've remembered to put Frank on the sea surface temperatures, and you can see that the temperatures there are pretty good, 28 to 29 degrees Celsius. So good sea surface temperatures there. It's going to be further south of that cold trail from the previous storms. Atlantic looking very good indeed. Temperatures pushing 30 degrees quite clearly in the Gulf of Mexico. Very warm there right now, and out over the Sargasso Sea region. Indian Ocean is looking fair as well, where that system is right now. It's around 28 degrees Celsius, and the 26 degree isotherm extends a few more degrees south, so it's got some chances. And in the Western Pacific here, we've got extremely warm sea surface temperatures, where that potential system is right now. It's entering areas of around 30 degrees Celsius, but sea surface temperatures is very rarely the issue with storms in this position. At this time of year, it's usually really broad systems that try to consolidate, or multiple low pressure systems that are struggling to resolve themselves to have one dominant system that ends up becoming that cyclone. Although Western Pacific sea surface temperatures are above average by quite a bit, Eastern Pacific is generally around average, and in the Atlantic the western areas are well above average, although the subtropical Eastern Atlantic is not, so storms that are out to sea, the fish storms, might have a little more trouble this year. Though in the Atlantic itself, in terms of oceanic heat content, extremely high values in the Caribbean Sea. In the Eastern Pacific, it's popping up just a little bit off the coast of Mexico, so it's still a few chances there. And in the Western Pacific, what do you expect? Huge amounts of heat content there, the powerhouse of the tropical basins. So let's take a look at computer models then, and you can see what happens here with Frank and with that other system. Frank takes over pretty cleanly now. Previous model runs were suggesting that it'll be a more drawn out process and it would hurt Frank quite a bit. Initially it does weaken, and you can see it start to strengthen and weaken, then strengthen again, but once it's actually interacting with that system, it looks like it gets away pretty cleanly there and intensifies to category 1, possibly high end, according to that model run. In the Western Pacific, watch this broad mess eventually turn out to become a tropical cyclone. There it is, and already reaching typhoon conditions very quickly before it reaches the Ryukyu Islands, so it could be a category 1 typhoon by the time it reaches the Imagery Islands if it heads that way. This is what the GFS is saying right now. Other models suggesting it might move closer to the mainland of Japan, and other schools of thought as well when it enters the East China Sea. Very weak steering patterns there right now, so we're really not sure whether it will hit China or whether it will move through the ocean and strike the Korean Peninsula, or just die at sea. And looking down at the Indian Ocean now, you can see this feature here. GFS once again giving it a chance of development. We've put it to 20%, as you know. It's just the broadness and trying to get that circulation sorted out. The northern side looks to be struggling for the most part there, and it only manages to get itself together for less than a day. It's a borderline case, that one, as to whether that actually happens. And that's according to the model run. The chances are actually less than that. And this is the precipitation chart for the Western Pacific over the next 7 days, and you can see that trail there from that potential typhoon headed towards Shanghai, and you can see it just stops short, because that's what the model says right now, that it dies off just before reaching those populated areas. 6 inches just offshore in terms of rainfall, that's around 300 millimeters, and you can see much higher values in the deep tropics, obviously, because obviously there's more energy and more moisture. And here's the long range, 5 to 10 days. You can see what happens to Frank there. A typical life, really. It dies off. Still quite broad there. It does broaden out a lot in those 5 to 10 day periods. And then behind it, another little disturbance entering the Eastern Pacific from the Atlantic, it would appear, and maybe that one has a very small chance towards the end of that 10-day period. Wouldn't put any faith in that one. Here's the rest of what happens in China there. You can see it completely dying off. Strong winds following it from that whole band that moves inland. The band might be more destructive than the actual storm if that happened. And then another storm forms behind it towards the end of that 10-day period and starts to wrap up to the northeast of the Philippine Islands. That's right at the end of that forecast period, so it's going to be fairly uncertain. We know what the models have been like this year so far for long-range West Pacific. Basically rubbish. That's the important stuff done with at this point. You can take a look at our Force 13 store by scanning that barcode. It will take you straight there. Take a look at our merchandise, shirts and hoodies and pillows and all that, including the Still Waiting for Hone range, because we are indeed still waiting for Hone. There's also on-demand animation requests available as well. So So looking at the super long range then, which is also not very serious, but you can see a big typhoon there striking Taiwan. Not to say that can't happen, it can happen. That looks like a category 4 landfall there in Taiwan as it briefly moved through and then into China later on. I mean, this we're talking about, when's that, the 7th or the 8th of August, so that is still quite a way off, and potentially a system there off Japan as well at a high latitude, maybe subtropical in nature, but who knows. And also in the Scilly Range, take a look at this curious little specimen off the coast of Indonesia that forms around, where is it? There it is, on August the 8th, and you can see it developing into a brief tropical cyclone possibly as it moves off towards the south eventually and southwest. That would be a bit of a mess. Anything that comes close to Indonesia can produce rain, and rain causes all kinds of problems over there, so that would not be a nice situation to see. Short and sweet and weak. Enough said about that, it's not going to happen. What did happen though on this day in 2001 was Typhoon Taraji, which is pictured there, headed towards Taiwan, ironically, saw the long range before. This is one of the deadliest storms in Taiwanese records, killing around 200 by the time it did make landfall a few days later. Kongray was weakening as a category 2 typhoon off Japan, and Delilah I think was also weakening at this point in the eastern Pacific Ocean. So that was on this day. How long ago was that? 21 years already. Meanwhile, this year the next name on the Atlantic naming list now is Danielle. In the eastern Pacific it's Georgette. In the central Pacific the next name is Hone. Yes. In the western Pacific we are still waiting out for Songda, and in the North Indian Ocean the next name will be Sitrang. 37 storms have formed so far in 2022. Still quite a way to go yet if we're going to get to our average of 92 per year. So the second half of the year is much busier than the first usually. In the Australian region the next name is Darian, the Southwest Indian Ocean starts with Ashley, and in the South Pacific next up is Harley. That's all for tonight's Tropical Weather Bulletin. We'll be back again tomorrow night.